Dutch Colonial Empire and the VOC, Netherlands. Shortly after the Dutch Republic had been founded, the Spanish had invaded the Netherlands one last time and took over the capital city of Antwerp. The city of Amsterdam had become the new capital of the Dutch Republic, which caused many Dutch Calvinists to flee from Spanish occupation to Amsterdam, where they brought their technical skills with them. In the very beginning of the 1600s, there was a peace treaty made between the Spanish and the Dutch. This peace enabled the Republic to heavily renovate itself within its own borders. More shipping capacity was created and many interconnected waterways were dug up that made travel from city to city easier and more efficient. The Dutch then opened trade networks all across the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, which increased their wealth. To rival the Iberian Union, the Dutch had to create an overseas trading empire. The overseas Dutch trade was controlled by trading companies, which would wage wars to open more trade opportunities and increase profits. The Dutch East India Company controlled most of the Old World trading colonies, while the Dutch West India Company controlled most of the New World trading colonies. Ghana. The East India Company had finally begun to set sail for the Indian subcontinent by traveling around the continent of Africa. The Portuguese had already set up a multitude of trading ports and colonies all over the coastal regions of Africa. One of these coastal regions in West Africa was called the Gold Coast. The East India Company had established a new trading port close to the already existing Portuguese one. The East India Company and Portuguese fought over the Gold Coast, and the declining Portuguese Empire had been pushed out. The East India Company would purchase many African slaves who had been captured prisoners of war from further inland. The land was originally inhabited by the Akan people, who were very wealthy from having so many valuable resources within their lands. Angola. The Portuguese had been ruling over coastal Angola, purchasing slaves, until a native kingdom known as the Umbundu kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba started trying to push the Portuguese out of their lands. The East India Company came and helped them remove the Portuguese colonial rule from Angola. The East India Company ended up taking control of the coastlines for a short time. Cape Colony. Trying to get to the Indian subcontinent, the East India Company arrived in the southernmost tip of the African continent. The East India Company would then establish a settlement called Cape Town as sort of a rest stop for their ships traveling from Europe to India. The East India Company had later imported many farmers from the Netherlands to establish agricultural land all along the coastlines of southern Africa. These Dutch descendant farmers became known as the Boers. The native peoples of southern Africa were the hunter-gatherer Khoisan tribes, and the slightly more advanced and extremely warlike Bantu descendant tribes. Mauritius. On their way towards India, the East India Company had found a pristine paradise island somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean. There was no native human population on this island. They named it Mauritius after Prince Maurice of Nassau. A few Dutch colonists started building settlements on the island. They saw the indigenous ebony trees as a tradable commodity to export. The East India Company started importing African slaves to cut down the ebony trees and also work on the new sugar cane and tobacco plantations. An invasive species of monkey called the long-tailed macaque were known for causing mayhem within the colony and disrupted a lot of its productivity. Ceylon. Finally, the East India Company had arrived in the Indian subcontinent. The island of Ceylon was very enticing to the Europeans during the spice trade. The Portuguese had been fighting the native Candian kingdom for control over the island. Like many times before, the East India Company would intervene and fight off the Portuguese to establish their own trading colony, which would push the Candian kingdom back into the landlocked interior of their own island. There were some Dutch settlers on the island who married into the local populations, and a new mixed-race group called the Burgher people emerged. Guyana. The West India Company came to Guyana to set up sugarcane plantations to export to other countries for the stimulation of the Dutch economy. They had imported many slaves from Africa to work on the plantations as free labor. The native peoples who lived there were the Waiwai, Makushi, Patamona, Lokono, Kalina, Wapishana, Paimon, Akawayo, and the Warao tribes. They were known for their slash and burn method when clearing land for agriculture, where they burn down large areas of dense jungle to make way for the foraging of crops. They were also known for their basket weaving and hammock weaving skills. For the Waiwai, people ate monkeys as a sign of pride. Suriname. After a war was fought overseas against the English, who were sabotaging Dutch overseas trade to help the Portuguese, the West India Company had annexed the English colony of Suriname. There were a few small English settlements which were quickly surrounded by company plantations with many African slaves. The native people of Suriname were the Arawak tribes. Many of the imported African slaves had escaped the plantations and fled into the deep jungles that made up most of the region. These former slaves were called the Maroons. These Maroons would often attack Dutch settlements. Brazil. During the Dutch-Portuguese War, the Dutch had invaded the Portuguese colony of Brazil and occupied a sizable portion of it for a short time. The Dutch had attempted to govern Brazil better than the Portuguese ever had. Brazil already had a large Portuguese descendant population already, so permanent rule wasn't very feasible. New Netherland. The West India Company had established a fur trading colony on the coast of North America. They established a new settlement called New Amsterdam, which was mostly a small hub for Dutch fur traders. The furs in question were mainly from the indigenous beavers that were very common there. The original inhabitants of this land were the Algonquian Lenape tribes, who had a matrilineal society where your lineage and identity primarily came from your mother's family line rather than your father's. The population of these tribes had been drastically reduced by diseases accidentally brought over from the Old World by the Europeans. The few Lenape people left, however, were seen by the West India Company as business partners who they could trade goods with. The company also had a good standing with the Iroquois Confederation. Malacca. The East India Company finally started to venture beyond India, even further into the Orient. The Portuguese were far ahead of them at this time and already controlled part of the Malay Peninsula called Malacca. The East India Company invaded the area and conquered it from the Portuguese. The trading port was surrounded by the Malay Johor Sultanate. Dutch East Indies. After the conquest of Malacca, the East India Company had ventured to the southern islands of Indonesia. Yet again, the Portuguese were already there. The East India Company gradually conquered most of the important Portuguese trading ports and replaced them with their own. Indonesia was the one place where the company sought to take full control of the entire region. They conquered most of the islands of Indonesia to dominate trade and monopolize. The VOC had even paid Japanese samurai to genocide several islands within Indonesia to quash any form of resistance. The native Mataram Sultanate attempted to fight off the company several times and came close to defeating them, but to no avail. Taiwan. The East India Company started moving north towards the East China Sea and and encountered an island called Taiwan. They quickly set up trading outposts there before any other Europeans did. The native peoples were Austronesian, related to the Indonesians and Malays from before. For the first time in decades, the Spanish waged war against them in Taiwan, but the East India Company fought them back. Afterwards, they had invited many Chinese settlers to work for them and increase productivity for the colony. There were so many Chinese settlers moving to the island for centuries that the Austronesians were outnumbered in their own land. Japan. The East India Company would finally reach the end of the Orient. Japan. Japan was already being influenced by the Portuguese. They had been selling the daimyo firearms, causing the rise of a new shogun to dominate the land. The East India Company arrived in Japan during the Tokugawa shogunate. The Dutch and the Portuguese were constantly competing with each other. The Portuguese were desperately trying to convert the Japanese to Catholicism, while the Dutch were simply there to trade goods. The Japanese purchased a plethora of Dutch literature that gave the Japanese a new renaissance of modern European knowledge of science, anatomy, mathematics, art, and other fields. New Holland. A Dutch explorer named Willem Jan Zoon, who was the captain of a ship and crew known as the Doifken, had encountered a new land south of the islands of Indonesia. They were the first Europeans to discover this new land. The Dutch later sailed around and charted the northern and western coastlines of this large, mysterious landmass. They named it New Holland after an area in the Netherlands. The land was not seen as very profitable for the East India Company, so no trade ports were built. This new continent would later be explored further by the British and renamed to Australia. Fiji. A Dutch explorer working for the VOC named Abel Tasman had begun to venture east of the islands of Indonesia into the more isolated islands of Melanesia. He was the first European to discover the islands of Fiji while trying to find a great southern continent. The native Fijians were a very communal culture, emphasizing strong family units. New Zealand. Abel Tasman and his crew encountered the islands of New Zealand and were about to land there until some native Maori people saw them and sent out 2 canoes. The canoe men started yelling, but the crew could not understand what they were saying. The canoe men started blowing their horns at them. One of Abel's crew members had a trumpet of his own and started blowing his trumpet at the canoe men. They both were blowing horns and trumpets at each other until it started to get dark and they eventually both stopped. The canoemen paddled back to the shore for the night, while the crewmen were keeping watch just in case as usual. The next morning, a larger canoe with more native people paddled toward the anchored ship. The crew tried to invite them aboard, but they kept their distance and eventually went back to shore. The next day, even more canoes with more people paddled closer to the ship. The crew had sent out a small boat with 6 crew members to make close contact with the natives. One of the Maori boats had paddled right up to the small boat. For some unknown reason, one of the Maori attacked one of the crewmen and he fell overboard and died. Several other crewmen were also attacked and killed. The main ship started shooting cannons towards the natives and the rest of the surviving crewmen shot at the Maori. Eventually, the ship pulled up its anchor and fled back out into the ocean. Tonga. Another Dutch explorer named Willem Schouten was the first European to discover the Polynesian islands of Tonga. He briefly traded with the native Tongans. Tongan women were exceptionally skilled at weaving mats, clothing, and other accessories. Samoa. A Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen was the first European to discover the islands of Samoa. Samoa. Tattoos were a very vital part of the native Samoan culture. They would tattoo their entire arms with intricate designs. The Western world would later take inspiration from the Samoans. Easter Island. Jacob Roggeveen would also discover the island of Rapa Nui on Easter. Because of this, he named it Easter Island. It seemed to be that the Rapa Nui were in the aftermath of a societal collapse. According to Jacob's accounts, the island had a very small population, but fertile land. The entire island had been deforested decades before. The Dutch crewmen had a skirmish with the natives and were forced to leave the island. The natives had caught several European diseases which killed off even more of their population.